My daughter-in-law said my old furniture was just junk waiting for trash day and started throwing my antiques in the garbage. What she didn't know was that she'd just tossed $620,000 worth of rare collectibles, and I was about to make her fish every piece back out. The morning started like any other Tuesday in Columbus, with me sitting at my kitchen table enjoying my coffee and reading the newspaper, when I heard a key turn in my front door. Before I could even get up to see who it was, I heard my daughter-in-law Cynthia's voice echoing through the hallway, sharp and determined. "Patricia, I hope you're decent because we're here to help," she called out, followed by the sound of multiple footsteps tramping across my hardwood floors. I set down my coffee cup and made my way to the living room, where I found Cynthia directing what looked like a small army of people I'd never seen before. There was a young man with a clipboard, two women in matching t-shirts that said "Fresh Start Cleaning," and my son David, who was standing by the door looking uncomfortable and avoiding eye contact. "What's all this?" I asked, looking around at the boxes, garbage bags, and cleaning supplies that had suddenly appeared in my home. Cynthia turned toward me with the kind of bright, aggressive smile that people use when they're about to do something you won't like, but they've convinced themselves it's for your own good. "Surprise," she said, spreading her arms wide. "David and I decided you needed help decluttering this place. Look around, Patricia. You can barely walk through some of these rooms with all this old furniture taking up space." I looked around my living room, seeing it through her eyes for the first time. The Victorian settee that had belonged to my great-grandmother. The carved mahogany secretary desk where my grandmother had written letters. The collection of blue and white porcelain that my mother had carefully arranged on the mantelpiece. To me, these were treasures, family heirlooms that told the story of 4 generations of women. To Cynthia, apparently, they were obstacles. "I didn't ask for help decluttering," I said quietly. "That's exactly the problem," Cynthia replied, pulling out her phone to show me what looked like before and after photos of other people's homes. "People in your situation never ask for help until it's too late. Look at these transformations we've done for other seniors. Clean, simple, modern, much safer and more practical for someone your age." David finally spoke up, his voice apologetic but firm. "Mom, we're worried about you. Last month when you had that dizzy spell, you said yourself that you tripped over the corner of that old trunk. This house is full of trip hazards." "One dizzy spell," I said, "and suddenly my home is a death trap?" "It's not just that," Cynthia said, already directing the cleaning crew toward my grandmother's china cabinet. "David and I have been talking about your future. What happens when you can't maintain all this stuff anymore? What happens when you need to move to assisted living? No facility is going to let you bring all these oversized antiques." The word antiques came out of her mouth like she was saying garbage. I watched in growing alarm as the woman in the Fresh Start t-shirt began wrapping my mother's Limoges plates in newspaper, clearly preparing to pack them away. "Where exactly are you planning to put my things?" I asked. Cynthia waved her hand dismissively. "Storage unit for now, estate sale later." "Patricia, you have to be realistic. Most of this furniture is so old that nobody wants it anymore. The styles are completely outdated, and frankly, some of it looks like it's falling apart." What happened next still makes my blood boil when I think about it. Cynthia had apparently planned this intervention down to the last detail, complete with a schedule and assigned tasks for each member of her cleaning crew. "We're going to start with the living room," she announced, reading from her clipboard. "All the heavy, dark furniture needs to go. That couch with the carved legs, nobody sits on furniture that uncomfortable anymore. The big wooden desk, completely impractical for modern living. And all these little decorative things collecting dust on every surface, total fire hazards." I watched in horror as the cleaning crew began systematically dismantling my living room. The Victorian parlor set that my great-grandmother had brought from England was being wrapped in moving blankets. The Eastlake side table where I kept my mother's jewelry box was being carried toward the door. "Wait," I said, stepping forward to stop them. "You can't just take my furniture without asking me about each piece." Cynthia looked at me with the patient expression people use when they think they're dealing with someone who's being unreasonably difficult. "Patricia, that's exactly why we're doing this for you instead of with you. If we asked about every single item, you'd find reasons to keep everything, and we'd never make any progress. Sometimes you have to make tough decisions for people who can't make them for themselves." "I can make my own decisions," I said firmly. "Can you?" Cynthia pulled out a folder thick with what looked like research materials. "Do you know how much it costs to maintain antique furniture? Do you know how much space you're wasting on pieces that serve no practical purpose? Do you understand the liability issues of keeping furniture that could collapse or cause injuries?" She showed me printouts of articles about senior living, home safety, and something called Swedish death cleaning, which apparently involved getting rid of all your possessions so your children wouldn't have to deal with them after you died. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a photo of a sparse, minimalist living room. "Clean lines, functional furniture, easy to navigate. This is how people your age should be living." David was nodding along, though I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. "Mom, Cynthia's been researching this for months. She found statistics about accidents in homes with too much furniture. She talked to experts about senior-friendly living spaces." "Experts," I repeated, watching as my grandmother's rocking chair, the one where I'd nursed David as a baby, was being carried out to a moving truck. "Occupational therapists, interior designers who specialize in aging in place, estate sale professionals," Cynthia listed them off proudly. "Everyone agrees that the key to safe, comfortable senior living is simplification and modernization." The worst moment came when Cynthia decided that some of my furniture wasn't even worth storing. "Patricia, some of this stuff is honestly beyond saving," she said, examining my great-grandmother's traveling trunk. "Look at these water stains, and the hinges are completely rusted. This isn't an antique anymore. It's just old junk taking up space." Before I could protest, she was directing one of the crew members to carry the trunk out to the curb. "What are you doing?" I asked, following them outside. "Tomorrow is trash day," Cynthia said matter-of-factly. "Might as well get rid of the unsalvageable stuff now rather than pay to store it." I watched in disbelief as my family's history was deposited next to the garbage cans. The trunk that had traveled from England to America with my great-grandmother's wedding dress inside. The carved wooden music box that my grandmother had kept her letters in. The delicate porcelain lamp that had sat on my mother's nightstand for 60 years. "This is insane," I said, starting toward the curb to retrieve my belongings. "Patricia, stop," David said, gently taking my arm. "I know this is hard, but Cynthia's right. Some of this stuff really is just old and broken. You've been holding on to it for sentimental reasons, but sentiment doesn't make something valuable." "And frankly," Cynthia added, "leaving broken furniture around the house is dangerous for someone your age. What if one of these wobbly chair legs gave out while you were sitting down? What if you cut yourself on a sharp edge from one of these chipped pieces?" She gestured toward the pile of my belongings at the curb as if they were evidence of my poor judgment rather than pieces of my family's history. "Nobody wants furniture from the 1800s anymore," she continued. "The styles are too ornate, the pieces are too big for modern homes, and maintaining them is expensive. Even if you could find someone to buy them, you'd probably have to pay them to haul them away." I stood there on my front lawn, watching strangers load a century's worth of family memories into a truck, while my own son and daughter-in-law explained to me why everything I'd treasured was worthless. By that afternoon, Cynthia had called in what she referred to as the final authority, a woman named Karen who ran estate sales for senior citizens who were downsizing. I've been in this business for 15 years, Karen announced, walking through my now half-empty house with the confidence of someone who'd seen it all. I can tell you right now that 90% of what you're keeping isn't worth the storage fees you'd pay. She examined the remaining pieces with the clinical detachment of someone appraising livestock. My mother's china cabinet received a dismissive shake of the head. The carved mirror that had hung in my hallway for 40 years got a maybe $50 at auction. The dining room set that had hosted 4 generations of holiday meals was declared too formal for today's market. The problem with furniture from this era, Karen explained to Cynthia as if I weren't standing right there, is that it was built for a different lifestyle. These pieces are too big, too dark, too ornate for modern homes. Young families want clean lines, light woods, functional furniture that can serve multiple purposes. She pulled out her phone and showed us photos from recent estate sales. See this Victorian parlor set? Similar to yours. We started the bidding at $500 and couldn't get a single offer. Finally sold it for $50 to someone who probably just wanted the wood for a craft project. Cynthia was taking notes, clearly vindicated by Karen's assessment. See, Patricia, this is exactly what I've been trying to tell you. Sentimental value and actual value are 2 completely different things. Now, there might be a few pieces worth keeping, Karen continued, but honestly, unless you have documentation proving provenance or designer attribution, most of this stuff is just old furniture that happens to look fancy. She picked up a small carved box that had belonged to my grandmother, turning it over in her hands like she was examining a piece of driftwood. For example, this could be worth something if it's signed by a known craftsman, but without provenance, it's just a decorative box that someone might pay $10 or $15 for. David looked relieved by Karen's professional opinion. See, Mom, we're not being heartless, we're being practical. Keeping all this stuff doesn't make sense if it's not actually worth anything. What none of them knew, what they hadn't bothered to research despite all their supposed expertise, was that I had been quietly educating myself about antiques for the past 3 years. It started after my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, mentioned that her daughter had made a fortune selling her mother's old junk on something called the antique market. Curious, I'd begun watching antique appraisal shows, reading collector guides, and even attending a few estate sales myself to see what people were actually buying and selling. I'd learned to recognize the difference between mass-produced furniture and handcrafted pieces. I'd studied the markings that indicated quality construction and valuable materials. Most importantly, I'd discovered that many of the pieces in my home weren't just old, they were rare, sought-after examples of specific periods and styles. My great-grandmother's Victorian parlor set, for instance, wasn't just any Victorian furniture. It was a documented Herter Brothers piece crafted by one of America's most prestigious 19th-century furniture makers. The signature was burned into the wood on the underside of each piece, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The carved mahogany secretary desk that Cynthia had dismissed as impractical was actually an 1880s Wooten desk, one of only a few hundred ever made. Collectors paid premium prices for Wooten desks because of their innovative design and historical significance. Even the worthless old trunk that was currently sitting at my curb was a documented Louis Vuitton piece from the 1890s, complete with the original interior fittings and travel stickers from luxury hotels around the world. But I'd never shared this information with David or Cynthia. I'd wanted to do my own research first to understand what I had before making any decisions about what to keep or sell. I'd planned to have everything professionally appraised when I was ready, not when someone else decided it was time to clear out my junk. That evening, after the cleaning crew had left and my house looked like it had been ransacked by well-meaning burglars, I sat down at my computer and began making some phone calls. My first call was to Dr. James Morrison, an antique furniture expert at the Ohio State University Art History Department. I'd contacted him months earlier when I first started researching my collection, and he'd been incredibly helpful in identifying several of my pieces. "Mrs. Patterson," he said when I explained what had happened, "please tell me you didn't let them actually dispose of anything." Most of it is in storage, I said, but they put some pieces out for trash pickup. There was a long silence. What pieces? I described the trunk, the music box, and the porcelain lamp that were currently sitting at my curb. Mrs. Patterson, you need to go outside right now and bring those pieces back into your house, he said urgently. The Louis Vuitton trunk alone is worth between $15,000 and $20,000, assuming it's in the condition you described when we talked earlier. My hands were shaking as I hung up the phone and ran outside to retrieve my belongings from the curb. Thankfully, the garbage truck hadn't come yet, and everything was still there, though the porcelain lamp had been knocked over and was now lying on its side in the grass. My second call was to Margaret Dewey, a certified appraiser who specialized in American antique furniture. I'd been planning to hire her to do a complete assessment of my collection, but the events of the day had made that decision urgent rather than optional. Based on what you've described, she said after I gave her a detailed inventory of my pieces, you're looking at a collection worth somewhere between $500,000 and $800,000, possibly more, depending on condition and provenance. I nearly dropped the phone. I'm sorry, did you say $500,000? At minimum, she confirmed. Mrs. Patterson, what you have is not just a collection of old furniture. You have a museum-quality assemblage of 19th century American craftsmanship. Some of these pieces are extraordinarily rare. She explained that the Herter Brothers parlor set alone was worth at least $200,000, assuming the pieces were in good condition and properly documented. The Wooten desk could bring anywhere from $50,000 to $75,000 at auction. Even the smaller pieces, the carved boxes, decorative objects, and porcelain, represented significant value when considered as a curated collection. I have to ask, she said, why are you calling me at 8 o'clock at night? Has something happened to your collection? The next morning, I called David and asked him and Cynthia to come over immediately. I didn't explain why, just that it was urgent and related to the furniture they'd removed from my house. They arrived within an hour, Cynthia carrying a folder of what looked like more decluttering research, and David bringing coffee and pastries, probably expecting to continue where they'd left off the day before. Mom, if you're having second thoughts about the cleaning, we can talk about it, David said gently. I know change is hard, but… Sit down, I interrupted, pointing to the couch, one of the few pieces of furniture they'd left in my living room. Both of you. I spread out the research materials I'd gathered over the past few years, appraisal documents, auction records, collector guides, and printouts from museum websites that featured pieces similar to mine. Before we go any further, I said, I need to show you something about the worthless old junk you've been throwing away. Cynthia looked at the papers with the expression of someone who was being asked to examine evidence of a conspiracy theory. Patricia, I know you've gotten attached to these things, but attachment doesn't create actual value. You're right, I said. Attachment doesn't create value, but historical significance, craftsmanship quality, and rarity do. I pulled out the documentation for the Herter Brothers parlor set, including the auction records showing similar pieces selling for six-figure sums. This Victorian furniture you called uncomfortable and outdated? I pointed to the photos of my parlor set in the storage unit. It's made by Herter Brothers, one of the most prestigious furniture makers in American history. The last documented set sold at Sotheby's for $230,000. David was staring at the paperwork like it was written in a foreign language. $230,000 for a couch and chairs? For a documented example of 19th century American craftsmanship, I corrected. The same craftsmanship you've been paying to store because you thought it was junk. Cynthia was reading through the auction records, her expression shifting from skepticism to confusion to something approaching alarm. But Karen said, she started. Karen said it wasn't worth anything because she didn't know what she was looking at, I interrupted. Just like you didn't know what you were looking at when you decided to throw it away. I pulled out more documentation, the Wooten desk evaluation, the Louis Vuitton trunk authentication, the porcelain collection appraisal. With each piece of paper, I watched their faces change as the reality of what they'd almost destroyed began to sink in. The total estimated value of my collection, I said finally, is between $600,000 and $800,000. The pieces you put out for trash pickup alone were worth approximately $35,000. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced with my family. Cynthia was staring at the appraisal documents like they might bite her, while David was calculating numbers in his head with an expression of growing horror. $600,000, he said finally. Mom, that's more than my house is worth. It's more than both our houses combined, Cynthia added, her voice barely above a whisper. And you almost threw it away, I said quietly, because you assumed that old meant worthless. Cynthia was reading through the documentation more carefully now, her professional confidence completely evaporated. But how are we supposed to know? You never told us any of this was valuable. You never asked, I said simply. You made assumptions about what I owned, what it was worth, and what I should do with it. You brought in so-called experts who made the same assumptions. None of you bothered to do actual research before deciding that my life's possessions were junk. David stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the moving truck that was still parked in my driveway, filled with hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of antiques that he'd helped load. Mom, I feel sick, he said. I literally helped carry a $250,000 furniture set out to a storage unit because we thought we were helping you get rid of clutter. The question now, I said, is what we're going to do about it. What followed was the most humbling conversation I'd ever had with my daughter-in-law. Cynthia, who just 24 hours earlier had been lecturing me about the worthlessness of my possessions, was now asking detailed questions about proper antique care and preservation. Mrs. Patterson, she said formally, having apparently lost the right to call me Patricia, I owe you the biggest apology of my life. I came into your home and tried to throw away a museum-quality collection because I thought I knew better than you. You did throw away part of it, I reminded her. If I hadn't made those phone calls last night, some of these pieces would be in a landfill right now. David was already on the phone with the storage company, arranging to have everything brought back immediately. Mom, we're going to fix this. Every single piece is coming back and we're going to set it up exactly the way it was before. No, I said, surprising them both. We're not going to set it up exactly the way it was. Their faces fell, probably thinking I was about to punish them by never forgiving their mistake. We're going to set it up better, I continued. Now that we know what we're dealing with, we're going to display these pieces properly. Climate control, security systems, proper lighting. We're going to turn this house into the showcase it should have been all along. Cynthia was crying now, quiet tears of genuine remorse. I called you a hoarder. I told people you were living in dangerous conditions surrounded by junk. I was so wrong. You were uninformed, I corrected. There's a difference. But now you know better, and that makes you responsible for doing better. Over the following weeks, my house was transformed in a way that Cynthia could never have imagined when she first proposed her decluttering project. Professional conservators came to assess and clean each piece. Museum-quality lighting was installed to properly showcase the furniture without damaging it. A security system was put in place to protect what was essentially a private museum. But the most important transformation was in my relationship with my family. David began visiting twice a week, genuinely interested in learning about the history and craftsmanship of the pieces he'd almost thrown away. Cynthia started researching antique preservation techniques with the same intensity she'd once applied to decluttering articles. I want to learn everything, she told me one afternoon as we were carefully repositioning the Herter Brothers satay. I want to understand what makes these pieces special so I never make a mistake like this again. The most important thing to understand, I said, watching her handle the carved mahogany with new reverence, is that value isn't always obvious. Sometimes the most precious things look ordinary until you take the time to really see them. 3 months later, we had the entire collection professionally appraised by a team of experts. The final valuation came in at $620,000, not including the pieces that would have been lost forever if I hadn't intervened in time. My daughter-in-law had said my old furniture was just junk waiting for trash day and started throwing my antiques in the garbage. What she discovered was that she'd just tossed $620,000 worth of rare collectibles, and the lesson about assumptions, respect, and the hidden value of family heritage was worth far more than any amount of money. Sometimes the biggest decluttering project isn't getting rid of your possessions. It's getting rid of the people who don't understand their worth.